The Trump baby blimp soars above massive protests of Donald Trump underway today in London. The White House orders Hope Hicks to defy a congressional subpoena, and the Democrats inch toward impeachment by calling Nixon whistleblower John Dean to testify as part of the Mueller hearings. Welcome to a busy Tuesday. We'll start with those protests underway in London. Trump just finishing up a day of meetings, including with outgoing Prime Minister Theresa May, an attempt to shore up an increasingly fragile relationship with our closest ally. And if he needs to move through London today, he will no doubt come across massive protests there in honor of his presence in the UK. Also protesting today, House Democrats who've given former Trump White House advisor Hope Hicks until today to comply with a subpoena for documents related to her testimony to special counsel Robert Mueller. Hicks today defying that subpoena and missing a deadline for those documents. The White House ordering Hicks, as well as former White House lawyer Annie Donaldson, to defy Congress and join its stonewalling campaign. House Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler responding today with this statement, quote, "The president has no lawful basis for preventing these witnesses from complying with our request. We will continue to seek reasonable accommodation on these and all our discovery requests and intend to press these issues when we obtain testimony of both Ms. Hicks and Ms. Donaldson." The House also announcing its plan to vote next week to hold Attorney General William Barr and former White House counsel Donald McGahn in contempt and to proceed with hearings on the Mueller report as soon as Tuesday. From the New York Times, quote, "The twin announcements were the party's latest attempts to kickstart stalled investigations into accusations of malfeasance by President Trump and his administration, and to try to force key witnesses resisting their oversight demands into compliance." On the more aggressive posture from the Democrats, Steny Hoyer, the number 2 Democrat in the House, issuing this statement, quote, "This administration's systematic refusal to provide Congress with answers and cooperate with congressional subpoenas is the biggest cover-up in American history, and Congress has a responsibility to provide oversight on behalf of the American people." And that is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. The host of Saturday Night Politics here on MSNBC, shaking up Saturday night, Donny Deutsch. Sam Stein, politics editor for the Daily Beast, shaking up everything else. Tim O'Brien is an executive editor for Bloomberg Opinion, and former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance is with us, plus former Assistant Director for Counterintelligence at the FBI, Frank Figliuzzi, joins us. Sam Stein, I've read your report last night on, this is my word, not your reporting, a bit of an insurrection inside the Democratic caucus against Nancy Pelosi and leadership. And what I wanted to ask you was if that is behind or contributing to what is definitely more aggressive posture, more leaning in today.
So where we stand right now is that there's a faction of House Democrats who favor impeachment that's over 50 at this point, and well over 50 at this point, still obviously not a majority, but they've begun to start what is known in sort of as an organic whip process, i.e. trying to get other members who are on the fence to come to support going to impeachment proceedings. That is, if you want to describe it as an insurrection, it sort of is, because Nancy Pelosi has been fairly straightforward, saying we need to pump the brakes a little bit, take this more meticulously, and she is actively whipping members, saying that it's politically imprudent to do this. So there are tensions there rising, and House leadership generally knows that they have to do something to tamp this down. Occasionally they can let air out of the balloon. Pelosi might go to the White House, have a confrontation with Trump. People seem to be relieved at that point. But one of the things that they're now trying to do is they're trying to kind of shift the focus of these hearings away from a more process argument and more towards the substance of the Mueller report. The problem is that they're calling John Dean, and John Dean, while he may be able to talk about the process of impeachment and cover-ups in general, was around in the Nixon administration. What the activists in this realm want to see happen is for them to call up people who are tangentially close to the Trump administration, may not be subject to executive privilege claims, and bring them up to the Hill. So people who are mentioned in the Mueller report itself, like Dimitri Simes, who is a Russian expert.
How about Chris Christie and Corey Lewandowski? No privilege. They are witnesses to the central flashpoints in the obstruction investigation. Trump called Christie about firing Mueller, and Corey Lewandowski, I think, was sent out like a political hitman to get Sessions.
So this is exactly the conversations I'm having, which is there are different ways into this than just going after the Don McGahns and the Hope Hicks of the world, who you know will say no. you can go to the next layer and try to get it for that. I don't know why starting with John Dean was the choice, but maybe they want to lay the foundation. So that's a state of play right now. There are tensions. I don't want to overstate them because clearly the conference is behind Pelosi. But now that you have members trying to actually actively encourage pro-impeachment stances, it's getting a little bit more serious.
And you're having conversations on Capitol Hill, too. Donnie, tell us about them.
Yeah. Let me just talk about my point of view as far as this, and I've talked about it a lot. I think there's a simple solution here, and it's not a binary choice, impeach, not impeach. There's a third lane, and it's a branding lane, and it's called the Trump criminal investigations. Take the impeachment word away. The impeachment word ends in the Senate. Okay, once again, I think the Democrats should own Trump as a criminal and say, basically, we know that Mueller found him guilty of obstruction of criminal act. He couldn't act because of DOJ guidelines. We know he's an unindicted co-conspirator in New York. We are going to continue with Trump criminal investigations. Keep saying those words. Brand it. You will eventually get to impeachment when public opinion is in your favor and when you think, I don't think you'll ever get to this point when you get 20 senators. But to me, the answer is stop making an argument about impeachment. Put that word to the side. Make it the Trump criminal investigations. And I do believe in the coming week or so, you're going to start to hear words like that coming out of Washington.
So they did that last session for Benghazi. They created a select committee of lawmakers. They removed it from a traditional committee process, and they just had one investigative committee focused to Benghazi.
Weren't there 5?
Well, this was a special select committee.
Even if it's not one, just as an overarching.
Now, this is what's interesting to me about the Benghazi committee was Democrats at the time faced a choice. Do they participate in that enterprise? And they decided ultimately to do so, to have a seat at the table. I don't know if Republicans would do so. So to your point, I think it does put Republicans on the defensive a little bit, even instantaneously.
Let Trump say he's not a criminal, just like Nixon said, I'm not a crook. It's that simple.
I think he may have said it already. Frank Figliuzzi, I can't believe I'm about to say this, but Donnie makes some good points there. I want to ask you, I'm just kidding.
No, the show doesn't work. The show doesn't work if we agree.
I can't even keep a straight face.
Nicole means to say, I want to push back on something that Donnie just said.
No, I didn't push back on anything. Frank, Donnie makes some good points, but marshaling evidence with the goal of moving public opinion is a different endeavor than marshaling evidence with the goal of a criminal prosecution. But I want to ask you where you see the intersection of John Dean and the Watergate era. I mean, I just hear this in my interactions outside of work that, is this Watergate? And I always say it's so much worse than Watergate. He's an unindicted co-conspirator in an illegal hush money scheme. The other guy's already in jail. Robert Mueller stood up last week and said, if I could say he hadn't committed crimes, I would. There were 10 incidents of obstructive conduct that were investigated. All the evidence is in the Mueller report. Witnesses like Chris Christie and Corey Lewandowski don't have a leg to stand on if they're called before Congress. How do you see this? What does this look like if Congress heads down this path, Frank?
So a couple of things. One is, shockingly, you're right. Donnie has made a great point. It's kind of a death by a thousand cuts argument. A strategy that says, look, we're being stymied from impeachment because we simply can't call fact witnesses, so we have a plan B. It makes sense to me if it plays out in the public eye on television screens. People get to see and hear the contents of the report and all that's been done wrong by this president. But here's also what's wrong simultaneously with that. And what upsets me the most is that that is an admission and an acquiescence that this White House has totally obstructed the oversight that Congress needs to have. So we're saying, okay, yep, we're stymied. We've got another strategy. Great. I'm worried about the long-term consequences of that. Are we, in fact, watching the reshaping of our form of government from a time where we had 3 equal branches of government to a time where we're moving toward an imperial presidency? 5-10 years from now, Nicole, are we going to look back at the summer of 2019 and say, that's when it started. That's when oversight by Congress started to erode. That's when we gained an imperial presidency. And I think that's what's happening.
Look, I agree with this point. And I think when you've got people like John Yoo, who were extremely polarizing and unpopular everywhere other than on the far right around the legislative battles after 9/11, sounding the alarms, I think that's right. And I think making the most with what you have, I agree this is the way to do it. But the truth is, Hope Hicks has defied a subpoena. Annie Donaldson defied a subpoena. Bill Barr is going to be held in contempt of Congress, as is Don McGahn. This is getting normalized by all these accommodations and Plan B and Plan C, isn't it?
Every criminal defendant that I've ever investigated would have loved to have had the power the president has here, telling witnesses, just don't comply with subpoenas. And so this can't be the way our system works, and yet Trump continues to get away with it. The real challenge Congress faces, because there's no one there to hold him accountable.
But guys,
and I think this is how he's operated throughout his life. He has recognized that the rules work because people self-enforce.
Guys,
Let
all
me
I'm
just get
saying
Tim's
is,
voice
okay,
in, and then we'll come around. Let me just get everybody in.
Well, I think Joyce is absolutely right. He spent 70 years pounding a hammer on anybody who walks through his front door, and he's gotten away with it. He's been insulated by wealth, and then by celebrity, and now by the presidency. He has these amazing, 3 rings of fire preventing him from being held accountable.
That's amazing. Tell me, but explain more.
Well, I think, most people go through their lives, and if they make mistakes or they break the law, they course correct or they reflect and they grow and they move on. But Donald Trump had his father's wealth insulating him from all of the problems surrounding him academically and then professionally, including bankruptcies as he got older. And then he became a celebrity through The Apprentice, and he got that sort of glow of celebrity mojo.
Literally and figuratively.
Literally and figuratively. And now he has the most powerful office in the land, to boggle the imagination, on top of those other 2 things, that gives him these constitutional privileges. And he's probably one of the most lawless and unethical people to occupy the presidency in the modern era, and yet he's also massively insulated from the consequences of his own actions.
And I'm going to come back to you, but I just want to say this is where I see it as parallel tracks. I appreciate and agree with the branding effort, and I think you're probably right. But I think there are constitutional and legislative norms, and if you read through the obstruction volume of the Mueller report, these were flashing yellow lights for people like Don McGahn and Annie Donaldson. And to continue to adjust to his 3 rings of fire, which is a fantastic way of thinking about it, is to let him win. And I've said this on the show before. Republicans, when they win, it's because they're brutal and ruthless. They were ready to impeach Rod Rosenstein, who was a fellow Republican. Democrats are interested in a branding effort.
No,
but hang on, I just want to get back to the lawyers. I mean, are there real legal equities to letting, and not just letting, encouraging and directing everyone that worked in the White House to ignore subpoenas?
There are real equities that need to be protected. The first thing is that those folks, Annie Donaldson, Hope Hicks, they don't have to listen to the president. They could decide, almost John Dean style, to show up and turn over documents and to testify. But the problem is this, as you point out, the Republicans have been willing to play a ruthless game here. And I think about it the way that one sometimes thinks about a card game that you play in multiple hands. If you're so focused on winning one hand that you're willing to blow up the entire game to win, there's no game left to play.
Okay, we're saying the same thing. I am not saying get rid of any of that. I'm saying right now, so you just don't make it about people. They've already won 2 cases. The judges already found for the Democrats in 2 instances of Trump not wanting to release. Keep that up. I'm just saying don't assign impeachment. It's a 20-month business plan. These are all part of the Trump criminal investigations. I'm not saying you should stand by and not let Hope Hicks testify. All I'm saying is don't put it all under the impeachment umbrella, because that allows them to play a game that they're going to win, and Trump to take the narrative they're out to get me. Let the narrative be Trump saying, I'm not a criminal, I'm not a criminal. So all I'm talking about, it's not branding in lieu of. It's branding as an overarching umbrella. I'm saying convict him in the court of public opinion. I'm saying be more ruthless. Don't leave it up to the Senate. Convict him as a criminal now.
So internally, House Democrats are with you. They felt, you talk to them now, and they feel like it's been, 6-7 weeks since the Mueller report's been out, and the entire argument is really a process and semantics argument. Will they comply with subpoenas? Is impeachment a politically viable idea? Where are the votes? And very few people are actually talking about the substance of the Mueller report. Obviously, very few people have read the Mueller report. And so tactically, what they're trying to do, at least this juncture, is to sort of educate the public to the extent that they can about what is actually the substance of the report itself. My suspicion is that by calling John Dean in, you can then have a more thorough, comprehensive argument about what presidential powers and the abuse of them are. The question
and
is,
you also put it on TV,
yeah,
which getting this on TV
and they recognize that too. I don't know if cable's going to go wall to wall on John Dean,
no.
But you can see the predicate being laid for maybe a Chris Christie being called up. The one thing I would say is that there are things that could push back against the president, what we haven't talked about. And one of them is, of course, the courts, which in 2 cases they have. But the other one is congressional Republicans. And congressional Republicans could, for respect to the institution of Congress, be speaking up more forcefully about the defiance of subpoenas and saying this is not a good precedent to set. And, though we disagree with the inquiries, the president should comply with them. But we've heard surprisingly little, if anything, except from Justin Amash, from those Republicans. And I think the damage is not necessarily short-term, it's long-term, in that the institution of Congress will suffer the consequences here.
Frank Figliuzzi, I would bet a dozen donuts every day for the rest of my life on this being true. If this were a Democratic administration, Republicans would have proceeded to impeachment. They would have done it after the Cohen sentencing memo revealed Donald Trump as an unindicted co-conspirator, basically an unindicted felon, or accused of a felony campaign finance violation. They would have done it after before Mueller spoke, but after the report came out. They would have figured out how to take those 10 incidents of obstruction. They would have taken even the sentence fragment from Barr's highly edited appearance that said does not exonerate, and we would be in the middle of the show wouldn't be on. We'd be sitting in impeachment hearings.
Yeah, it's always a helpful exercise to ask yourself to change the shoes, right? If I were on the other side, what would this look like? And clearly, we would be seeing GOP heads explode on Capitol Hill if it were Democrats resisting like this. And that's counter to the argument that we should kind of do things simultaneously or just pursue one avenue. The problem is that if we allow this to happen, allow our form of government to literally be reshaped in terms of the powers of each branch, someday, another party will be in power, and on that day, we should not expect that party to do the right thing. It is human nature to say, I'll take the more powerful position here. If they didn't do it, I'll do it. And that's why I continue to say, without trying to be overly dramatic, we could be watching the reshaping of our democratic principles. And that's why we've got to have Congress come out and say, look, what the president is doing isn't just a political battle over specific pieces of evidence. It is an outright rejection of our oversight duties, and therefore he should be impeached for that alone.
Frank, I went back and read, I always try to read a little bit of Nixon history before I come on television and talk about impeachment. Nixon ultimately was not impeached, but the conversations around his impeachment, the first ones were not even about Watergate. They were about high crimes and misdemeanors as it pertained to other conduct. So if you look at this president's conduct, I mean, you could take his immigration policies. They're babies in vans for 39 hours. I mean, it's such a target-rich environment if you want to look at conduct that's worth investigating and examining. And I understand, and believe me, as a former communicator, I appreciate and sympathize with the challenge to get airtime, to get bandwidth on the public's weary and anxious attention span. But it would seem there's nothing more urgent than peeling apart the criminal conduct or the conduct that at least Robert Mueller, who was unimpeachable to a vast majority of Americans, said he couldn't describe as non-criminal, and scrutinizing that in any way they can figure out how to do.
I think if you include Mueller as a larger totality of the circumstances, take the report plus the report on steroids, as you're saying, and all the other reasons why this president has failed in his office, then you do have a body of evidence. The challenge of Donnie's approach, though, is the fact witnesses. So the question is, how many fact witnesses can really be allowed to show up? Do people on the periphery, even the Chris Christies of the world, do they add to the body of evidence? Do we need to take the report and just enter it into evidence and say, that's it? How do we get this before the American people, and what constitutes sufficient evidence?
I think it was Sam who used the word process. We've now spent 18 minutes talking about process. And I think that when we have these conversations about reminding people of what Mueller found, it's a disservice. So just do that for me for this hour. What did Mueller find in volumes 1 and 2?
So the Attorney General gave Trump the ability to go out and tell the American people that the report found no collusion and no obstruction. That's not true. The report considered conspiracy, not collusion, and said there was not sufficient evidence of conspiracy to indict. And then the report looked at obstruction, and after relating, I think, at least 12 circumstances, 12 instances of conduct where the president could have been indicted for obstruction of justice Bob Mueller concluded that he could not say that the president was not culpable of the crime of obstruction. He could not indict him because he didn't have jurisdiction. He strongly implied that only Congress did, but he said, I cannot exonerate the President of the United States for having committed the crime of obstruction.
And because this whole conversation was framed by your argument, I want to give you the last word.
My only question is a legal question. Can't the Democrats go after whatever they need without calling it impeachment? Aren't there other judicial avenues, ways, the same way they're already doing it in the courts and they're already 2-0? So my point is not to let up on the legal process, but aren't there ways without calling it impeachment hearings to get what you need?
Yeah, I
That's what I'm saying.
absolutely agree with you. Impeachment
Well,
is just like indictment.
Yes and no.
No, I mean,
Impeachment does give lawmakers greater standing in the court of law, and they can. It heightens obviously the investigative import of it. But beyond that, as I was talking to lawmakers yesterday, if you start with the impeachment proceedings, you can go and say you're making a because this whole thing is drawn up on whether there's a legislative purpose to these oversight hearings, which is sort of a made-up thing anyway. But you can actually say there is a legislative purpose to the oversight hearings if it is a formal article of impeachment.
But you can do it without that.
But the Justice Department views the commencement of impeachment as a stronger tool that would compel them to cooperate.
Maybe where grand jury material is concerned, but impeachment is just an indictment. You don't walk into your office one day and file an indictment. You investigate leading up to that.
But they will
So
get stronger
all of
subpoena
these
power,
things can
right?
be
They're going to
true
get
once.
enhanced subpoena power if there was
Maybe,
an
but
impeachment.
frankly, I think it's a distinction without a difference. I think the legal standard is whether or not there are judicial proceedings moving forward, and you can make that argument once you're investigating.
What is it?
Okay, when everyone screams rap, I like to do one last thing. Lightning round, do they impeach?
I don't think that they will, at least not successfully in the Senate.
Yeah, I'm
Of course not in the Senate. I mean, do you think the House needs to go to impeachment?
I think the House needs to show spine on the hearings to begin with. I think the first thing they can do is start to push back in a very robust and uncompromising way with the White House.
It's not a lightning
My
round.
reporting is saying that, yes, eventually they will end up starting impeachment proceedings. It's
Trump
just a matter of
criminal
when.
investigation. Start them today.
Last word to you, Frank.
The level of obstruction will reach the point where the House will have little choice but to impeach.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.